Well, welcome back again. We just talked about this application that we're going to use as kind of a straw man for discussing NX. Had a really good use case. Primarily, we were interested in needing to separate out and have firm separation, preferably something we could even tool, separating a library from a host application of that library, as well as we had many layers of modules that we needed to consider. And so now we're going to go ahead and pivot into actually discussing the Firebase, the the NX implementation under the hood.
Too many technologies.
Yeah.
I think you're going to have to make your fonts bigger for anybody watching to have any idea what we're doing. Maybe one more even. Kind of like we do in class, you know.
All right, so the structure of this project, again, it's a Firebase app, and at the moment, the Firebase tools don't really play all that great with the NX tools. There's a whole collection of assumptions on both of their parts about like how to structure your projects. And so the very first thing at the top level is that you have a client folder in there, and then the rest of the stuff. And the rest of the stuff is actually more about the Firebase hosting, Firebase functions, all of the Firebase code, managing that. Because technically, with this being deployed on Firebase, we're kind of letting that be the primary owner.
So it's like a Firebase app wrapped around a family of apps built with NX.
Right.
That's cool.
Right.
Firebase only
And
deploying
so,
one.
so
Cool.
NX folks, if you found a way to share to make the Firebase functions code interop with NX libraries, that would be amazing.
Like if you could have an NX project that was Firebase functions and have it
Right.
and lace it all back up.
Some other primary challenges is actually the Firebase projects themselves have a node version conflict. They're very nailed down to a specific version of Node. So yeah, that might be a while.
I will take a small amount of credit. I'm taking like 0.003% credit for it not being worse, because in the early days of Cloud Functions, I was on a mailing list and there was discussion of node versions, and there was actually discussion of it being locked to node 4 at the time, and like 6 was popular and 8 had just come out. And I complained somewhat loudly that like, hey, like the rest of the node world like marches forward, and people are really going to hate it if this hot new thing comes out and it tells us we have to go backward. And I don't know if I had any impact, but I think everyone else in the mailing list all piled on. And so maybe that joint small rebellion on an early mailing list.
As we often say, it's all his fault.
I led an insurrection, is what I'm saying.
Yep. So the client directory within this project is where all of our NX stuff is happening on this project. And so all of the config files that you see here, these are all kind of brought in by NX whenever you create your project with NX. I did not have to add Prettier. Prettier is actually in the box as well. Prettier just... Actually, I have an old Karma file in here because I was previously doing unit testing with Karma when they switched to using Jest, and I've not been able to make the switch yet on my code to take advantage of
But you will eventually.
Yeah. And so, the NX file,
so
all
what's
of
in
those...
the NX file? What is that?
Oh, that is a fun place. So a lot of the tooling here that NX brings to the table lives just way outside the scope of like your linting tools and your TypeScript tools. Like they actually pile on quite a bit of tooling on top of this. And so this is where they get their sense of like what is the space of your project that you're working with.
Okay.
And so we'll dig into that here after a bit. So
it's similar to Angular.json, correct? Like in terms of what it does.
Well, there's still an Angular.json file.
There is,
but what I'm saying is like it's an analog of the Angular.json for NX.
Sure, yeah. If we're talking about like what are your projects and a little bit of metadata about each, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So in NX there are basically two different types of projects. You either have an application or you have a library.
Okay.
And that's true regardless of whether or not you're talking about Node, Express, Nest, Angular, React. Everything is either an app or a library. And they make no distinction whether it's front end, back end, or which library you're using.
Okay.
And as an aside, like you're using this on React also on some other work.
Yeah, on
right?
some other work, yeah,
Okay.
I have a React app and an Angular app living side by side
Great,
using the
great.
same exact
Cool,
tool
cool.
chain.
Yeah, I was confused when I asked what was in the NX file. I thought client was your top level application, and it had an NX file inside it. That's why I was confused.
Yeah,
I'm
no.
following now.
The
Yep.
client's basically just an NX thing.
Right, the client.
Like the
It
entire.
really means
Yeah,
like,
like-
all the code that's not
Yeah,
Firebase.
like
code.
I could
Right.
have
Yeah,
named
the
client
client.
anything.
Yeah.
Right.
The
But-
client folder is your NX workspace.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Because in
Yeah.
my situation, in this application, I don't have NX handling any of the server-side concerns because Firebase is my
Right,
server side.
Right.
All the code
Okay.
he's doing with NX is all client code.
Yep.
Right.
So we call it client. Got it.
All right. So unpacking this a layer, if you go into apps, whenever you ask it to create you an app, it'll also create out the E2E application right next to it. So they treat their E2E as sibling applications because you can actually tweak and adjust how those compile and build separate from the application itself. In fact, you'll get a set of different global types that become available to you when you're E2E testing. So that's what the apps folder is, and then the libs again is everything else. Before I dig too deep into libs, just want to put a little disclaimer out there. The structure that we're applying in this project is overkill. Because I went ahead and said, you know what, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of like see, I'm going to go all the way. And so I picked up the Enterprise Patterns book from folks at Narwhal and said, all right, let me just go ahead and apply these techniques to this, just to live in that space for a while and kind of get familiar with it. That way, when it comes time to consult and whatnot, I'll have that familiarity.
So you're
And so-
using this internal thing to like turn the knobs to 11, but
Right.
maybe only turned them to like 9.5 on customer work.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's kind of my MO. Is that like I pick up a pattern and then I drive off a cliff with it. That way I can
Yeah.
come back to the next person and say the cliff's over there. Please stop.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yep. And that's what I did. And so like if you look through here, some of it's a little messy because I made some bad decisions with some of my first times through. Having learned from them, I went ahead and did some better things afterwards. But the basic idea is that they would have you structure your project in such a way where you have this scoping mechanism. And the scoping mechanism is directly tied to your directory structure. Okay? And they have, so for example, in my libraries, I have a scope of form admin. Even though form admin is the name of my actual client application, there's still a notion of here's a collection of libraries that are only relevant in the context of your form admin. So this is very different from like if you're just kind of like going through following the very standard thing of like, hey, how does an Angular app get built from the scratch? Very different view of the world. In this place, you say, okay, my app is almost nothing more than an app module. Everything else is a library, and it's kind of that idea that if you make it reusable, then you'll actually reuse it, or the corollary being, if you don't make it reusable, you never will. And so that's kind of the approach here.
So in the dark ages, like 2 years ago or whatever, Paul, you and I did something similar but less polished using Lerna,
Yes.
and it was quite rough at the time.
Yeah, it's still.
But we still got some benefit from it. One thing we didn't have with that was the 2-layer deep structure that NX supports in the box.
Mm-hmm.
But my first question is it just 2 levers deep, or is it actually arbitrary depth?
Oh,
And
no.
the second is, how much benefit do you feel like you're getting from that additional, like you feel like it's more feasible to divide into many more small pieces? Because remember what we saw at the time when we looked at people's Lerna examples is they ended up having like a very long list of packages. Like just comprehending the list of packages on some stuff, some mono repos was like overwhelming.
Sounds like Chris had something to say on that.
Now that I see you're talking about something I care about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I know
Okay.
you've been doing a lot of this
We
stuff
should
as well.
introduce
Came in
Chris.
to get a drink,
She's
but
just
hey.
appearing on camera. Okay, so that was my point though. This is so the huge leap that beyond what we were doing with early rough tools is first that it actually works. Stuff we were using hardly worked, and second that there's a deeper organizational structure than what we were doing with Learn back then.
Can
So,
I?
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please.
jump in.
So on mine, I'm migrating an enormous, ridiculously enormous app, and so like, he has got feature dash, blah, feature dash, and for me, I was like, oh, this is gonna be ridiculously huge. So instead I have a feature folder, and under that I would have hooks and nav bar because I'm gonna have a ridiculous number of libraries.
Right.
So I do have the hierarchy of folders is arbitrary. So I have a much more deeply nested structure because I need more organization.
And does the does the naming of the folders in a conventional way constitute the structure, or does that nx.json file have to restate the structure?
It's stated in index.json, angular.json, and
the
TS
actual
config.
naming of the modules
the
themselves.
naming of the module and in TS
Okay.
config.
Okay. And are there tools that will warn you, hey, your module didn't follow the naming structure implied by the location in the hierarchy?
I don't think it does it that way, but when you generate your library for the first time,
Okay.
it generates it based on the path that you told it to place,
Right.
the path and scope that you supplied when creating the
Because
library.
one of the frustrations that you had even with CLI, not even going to this much deeper tool set, is that it helps you so much when you're making a thing, but you go to rename a thing and it's like on your own now.
Yeah, I don't think the name of the module actually matters that much, but the pathing. So I've done this multiple times. Is renamed something. So sometimes it's easier to just generate a new library, and then drag the lib folder into it.
Okay.
Because there's 3 different files that you have to update, at least, and it also affects your import everywhere else. Because the import reflects the folder structure.
Right.
So when you talk about that library, you'll say the whole path to it.
Yeah, because it would be like at form admin / feature hooks. Well, see, his isn't that hierarchical. Mine's more hierarchical. So mine would be like at form admin / feature / my feature name.
Oh, yes, sure enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that
okay.
can be a pain if you move stuff around.
So
Also, how well does VS Code support this?
Yeah.
Well, my WebStorm is sort of hit or miss as far as. I know.
Hey.
Chris said something less than glowing about WebStorm?
Has a little bit of trouble with the paths.
Yeah, no,
A little bit.
It works pretty.
So
I would say it works. I would not say it works well.
Okay.
So this is like my only gripe so far, and I would suspect this is probably going to be true of any tool that you try and point at the monorepo problem, is that VS Code really has a slow time of actually making the connections and lacing things up.
So
VS Code can't, like, when you move a library around and it's aliased with this @ngx forms path, VS Code knows how to figure out where you moved it and update your import lines. Because I've had problems with that when if I'm using relative paths, it can figure it out.
Yeah, no, it will not do what you said. Anytime you put at something, like you're pretty much on your own with the
You got me
refactor.
excited.
But theoretically it could, right? Like theoretically a future VS Code could go look at your TS
Look at your TS
config
config
and
It would be
Like,
nice if
it's just
NX
patches
included
look
that in the schematic.
yeah, but if it's an actual enhancement to VS Code.
I know. Well, I don't care about VS Code. For me, it would be helpful if it was part of an NX schematic. Like, remove
So
your library.
I don't want to derail you
Yeah.
too much more, but over in Bazelland, the issue commonly run into is that you can now feasibly work on and incrementally rebuild bigger apps than you can even reasonably open in an IDE all at once. Is there any tooling in here to help with that problem? Like to open just a part of it and have the tooling work on the part you have open without having the whole universe open?
So I don't know of anything that's explicitly built that way, but the way it kind of shakes out is I think it is possible, especially when you're following their recommendations for the folder structuring, that you could open it up at any arbitrary depth there.
Okay.
Because a large part of the buy-in of NX is that you get to actually specify your import boundaries. And you get some of it by default, but then you can further extend it to say these things are allowed to import from this space and vice versa. And so you can usually get it to where you're only importing like below where you're currently hosted.
You can get a long way just like getting a faster, bigger dev box.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no,
Well, carry
that's definitely one of the tipping points of using this to where, like, yeah, as this thing gets bigger, I'm already starting to feel the stress of it trying to keep everything straight in memory. And this is on a big fast dev box that I have that it even struggles. So it's kind of buyer beware in that regard. Okay.
Chris,
So
on what are you having to do anything to deal with that you're working on a really big app, which is lots and lots of
It was
code.
already really big. I'm just
Like,
making it up.
how was the IDE experience? Like, is it bad enough? Is the IDE getting bad? Is it that big that the IDE can't handle it, or?
No.
Okay, great.
well, and the badness that I'm referring to only shows up in the linking and understanding of the relationship of files.
Okay.
So like getting it to like control click and follow an entity to a new file depends on the day.
Okay.
Yeah, I find like after I built the whole project, then it kind of catches up more on like figuring out where the heck those imports are. But it's like hit or miss. I guess that's why I didn't understand what you were asking
Yeah.
me.
That's what I was. Is it
That's-
robust or is it hit or miss?
It's
That's
a-
what I was.
The import thing is a little hit or miss. Otherwise it's fine, but
Yeah, I find myself quite often hitting Control P or Control Shift P and then going in and hitting reload window and letting it cycle through, and then you got to wait down here for it to initialize.
Yeah.
And so I find myself doing that often, but only as I'm working out new, the introduction of new
Okay.
libraries, new apps.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
after you get it to figure it out the first time, it's fine.
So this is probably just a segue into the next thing you were going to talk about anyway. But I see, you just shifted your way of developing into, you've got these small apps and then most of your features are in libraries and then you tie it together. I can do that with the CLI, right?
Not easily.
No?
Yeah, no, because the way the CLI structures their library system is that it's a manual rebuild. Like they don't actually have any kind of like in-memory linking
Okay.
of what your library code says today versus what the
So that's the
app is
part I was
expecting to
missing.
consume.
Yeah.
think
I
their
do
goal
have
is
to,
get there.
if I'm developing in the libraries, I do have to keep running a build on my library in order to work with it. So
Yeah.
okay.
Right.
And furthermore, they don't have the tooling that says when you start your project, have it figure out the dependency surface and rebuild for you. You have to make sure you
cool.
understand the dependency surface and manually rebuild in the correct order the entirety of your library up to the point in which you're ready to rebuild your app. And next, like core to it is the understanding of the dependencies of all of these pieces. And it's just core to all of their tools is that understanding. So they look at the graph and they will, in memory, like from an npm start, build from the leaves of the library dependency up to the app itself whenever you do a file change.
So I think
Okay.
I
So,
finally understand the relationship now, because like not working at Google is great because you can just make up what it seems like they're probably doing from listening to what a bunch of people that work there say. But it seems to me that the Google solution, like core internal solution, is you use Bazel for that. That's what it does. It's amazing at that.
That screams Bazel to me.
Right. Yeah, it screams Bazel. Yeah, we're both working on it. So and so it may be that CLI will eventually get there by means of Bazel.
Could be.
Maybe.
And so this has the advantage of this works right now, though, very easily, which is a very compelling feature.
Now, what does I've only heard of and used Bazel in the context of what you've worked on. Is there support in Bazel for actually doing any kind of code support, like when you're actually doing the dev work? So, for example, like I actually get an error if I try to import from a library that I've like forbidden an import of,
So I have
or reversed a relationship.
the Bazel solution that would make that other code not even available to compile against, as opposed to making it available but having a rule that stops you from compiling against it.
Gotcha.
So it's a different way of achieving the same thing.
Interesting.
Can you show where you define those dependencies? Because I haven't done that step yet.
Yeah, so if we head back over to that nx.json file, the primary mechanism that they use to set up the import restrictions is based around their tags mechanism. And so this is a feature that, as far as I can tell, is strictly unique to NX, at least in the Angular space. And so as you create your libraries, you're asked to tag them in a particular way. Again, if you go read their enterprise patterns book, you'll see a breakdown of what you're expected to do, what patterns they recommend for tagging. But the basic idea is that you specify a scope, meaning like what is the footprint of the monorepo that this library should be exposed to, essentially. And their basic recommendation is that, well, that actually needs to be the top level grouping folder in which this library was created. So for my case, because I know that this is shared, I know I'm going to find that shared is the top level location at which this library is going to be available. So sure enough, shared data access Firebase. So the whole naming convention, folder convention, making them the same helps you be able to identify it, within the hierarchy just from the naming alone. So then they also have a different axis of tagging, which is called the type. And so the type actually ends up, according to their recommendations, showing up in the name of the library that you're creating. And they recommend keeping it down to 4: UI, data access, util, and feature.
Sure.
And so every library that you ever generate, if you can't figure out what one of those to put it in, probably means you're scoping the idea of your library too broadly. And so you should like refactor, resplit the ideas so that you can get them down to one of these 4 categories of things.
You don't use the default enterprise answer of putting the entire app in util?
No.
I've worked on that app before. I didn't create it, but I've worked on that
That's
before.
the app I'm trying to refactor right now.
I got
Well, it's called shared.
trying to unshared,
Yeah.
unutil it all and like spread it out into well organized.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And so
It's really great.
these 2 things work together in conjunction with your TSLint file. Yep, your TSLint file has a section for enforcing module boundaries.
Right.
And so in here you can specify dependency constraints, where you can, for each individual library and an app, you can say that you can only depend on this thing, can only depend on these things based upon the tags that are in your inx.json file.
Can you do like there's a source tag scope : could you have source tag, could you have like the type in there?
This is any arbitrary tag string similar as to what you would find.
And you can make up your own tags.
These I'm just pulling from the default recommendations.
Right. Okay. I'm just
from that patterns
tried
book.
this yet,
So this capability is great. I have really missed it because I worked on a project, I think in like 2001 in Java, where we had a mechanism like this. And it wasn't in JSON because there was no JSON then, but this kind of thing is incredibly valuable on projects sprawl and get big. It's just,
It was probably really bad in XML.
It was really bad in XML. Yes. That's a good assumption.
Everything is bad in XML.
Yeah.
Did you do anything like this in your extensive Java experience? Dependency rule stuff?
We had some weird stuff going on.
Yeah.
Like we had different.
It seemed like it was something that companies teams built on their own in that era.
Yeah, it was ugly.
Yeah.
So this mechanism here is what I'm using as a primary feature that lets me get that hard separation of making sure that my library code never accidentally depends on anything from my application code. That way when it comes time to split and ship these things separately, I don't have to worry about that.
Okay. So one of these rules accomplishes that exactly.
Well, this one right here says that my form admin is scoped to only these, and then eventually I could scroll down and I could find anything that has a scope of, I believe this one's the one. Anything that has a scope of ngx-forms, meaning my library, it's only allowed to depend on this one piece right here.
Okay.
So it can't, like if I try to import anything from form admin into ngx forms, it's going to say no. You'd have to allow that.
So how does this scale though? I imagine if you have a lot of libraries, this is going to be really hard to
It's
keep
not
up
per
with.
library, it's per
Or
category.
it's
of
per
library.
category. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
I see.
So I could have put
Every time
any
you find a
arbitrary
category, you
tag
put it
here.
in the scope. Okay.
Yeah. This is great because this is one spot where a lead can go make sure nobody else screwed anything up. They make sure that this one file is correct and then run the build and then you know like nobody did something they were
Like
supposed
a
to.
higher code review standard on this file
Yeah.
than your other.
Yeah.
Rather than blind merge as your.
All right. So that's
This is what we're looking for.
the
Discover.
primary aspects of it.
Definitely.
You've got your app and your lib generation. You've got the maintenance that needs to occur in the linting file and the NX file in order to help set up your boundaries. You have to kind of deal with the fiddly bits of the getting the naming, scoping in your directories, and then beyond that, it's just basically a matter of using it like you would have liked to have used the CLI at that point.
Yeah, I first did this with this using the CLI as an experiment on a new project. We broke everything out and it was so painful. And I'm doing pretty much the exact same thing with NX, but it's a lot better.
Oh,
It's
I know.
not painful.
We're probably going to be dealing with this soon. How have you dealt with putting NX into an existing application that's already split up into like apps and libraries, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so we migrated a different project, not this one. We started off with the CLI. We got to where we had about 6 libraries before I was, basically crying uncle.
We got to 2.
Well, I decided that I was going to be super clever. The client that we were at, they were really interested in learning about our process and our iterative approach to things. They were interested in X, but were initially worried about taking on, another thing that they needed to learn. But I went in and I basically made the best showing I could of doing it with just the CLI. And so I put in there a bunch of my own like nodemon bash scripts that attempted to like watch the file system and incrementally rebuild in the appropriate order. And I was somewhat successful at that, but it only goes so far without like basically rewriting NX. Like the next step from where I was well, I may as well rewrite NX. So I kind of stopped it there, presented that and explained that to the client. And then at that point, when I'm like, all right, yeah, this is basically the best showing I can make of this story with the CLI, they'd already knew about the benefits of NX, but they said, you know what, yeah, you're probably right. Your assessment that it is worth the overhead of learning NX in order to not have to deal with this build story. So they said, go for it. And so then we went ahead and we converted, and it was, in our case, it was only about 6 libraries, but at that point, it was already quite painful to not have an X. And then in terms of converting it, it was basically just a little bit of file rearranging. I think we created a new NX workspace, and then we created all of the relevant apps and libraries, and then copied the folders into the right spot from there. And like there's a few bulk edit and replaces, but for the most part, it was just a mechanical transformation.
Because the libraries have the same structure as any other CLI
I was going to ask you to
library.
open one up just
Right.
to